And this is the Oregon team. We'll start with congratulations. This is our chance to tell you that. Um, my name's Lindsay Draper. We're going to introduce ourselves to you, and we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves and your teacher. But really do need to emphasize how proud we all are in a difficult year. Not only did you all hold it together and get this done, but you managed to make it to the top 12, which said you did a darn good job. So really understand how proud we are of you. I am in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, retired from the juvenile court bench here. My colleagues are.
Good afternoon, I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
Hi, my name is Thomas Mackey. I'm in the history department at the University of Louisville and with the law school here at the University of Louisville.
And could you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Hello, we are Unit 2 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. It is great to see you guys. My name is Henry Kanzler.
I'm Annalise Quinton.
I'm Christopher Bianco.
I'm Willie Gagnon, and this is our teacher, Misty Pasquale.
Okay. I appreciate that. It's great to see you too. I like that. That's very nice. Okay, we're doing the first question out of Unit 2. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? Begin.
When the 55 delegates, similar in status and occupation, met in the Pennsylvania State House, consensus seemed achievable. However, when the Delaware delegates refused to accept any form of proportional representation, the convention split into two camps: the unlikely big state deep South alliance in favor of proportional representation, and the small states, prompting the first and greatest disagreement at the Constitutional Convention. Bolstered by his Southern allies, Madison was initially confident that his plan would succeed. However, the small states mounted staunch opposition. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed a compromise, a lower house based on proportional representation with an upper one vote per state, resolving the first disagreement of the convention.
Inseparable from representation was the second major disagreement at the convention: whether slaves, who made up 40% of Southern population, would count for legislative apportionment. The South wanted slaves to count as a full person to increase Southern power and protect slavery. Northern delegates, such as Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, disagreed, claiming that slaves were property, not people. Ultimately, the delegates narrowly agreed to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation. None of the delegates came to Philadelphia motivated to abolish slavery, leaving the issue unresolved and ultimately allowing the institution's continuance. The Constitution's protections for slavery encouraged its expansion in the South. At the dawn of the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history that claimed over 600,000 lives, almost 4 million people were enslaved in the United States.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments finally addressed slavery and began to resolve the issue of citizenship. However, the Black Codes, followed by the Jim Crow era, and the continued oppression of Black Americans prove that the consequences of slavery still impact our nation. Another unresolved issue with wide-ranging consequences has been the extent of executive power under the Constitution. While the convention carefully enumerated Congress's power in Article 1, Section 8, they left the president's power ambiguous, vesting them in Article 2, Section 1 with all executive power. President Jackson's forcible deportation of tens of thousands of indigenous Americans, Japanese internment by executive order under President Roosevelt, and President Nixon's secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia during the Vietnam War exemplify the consequences of a failure by the framers to clearly outline the powers of the president.
We support amendments that would modernize our Constitution to ensure its relevance to our constantly evolving nation. First, we would amend the Electoral College to require proportional allotment of electoral votes in each state, similar to Nebraska and Maine, placing the election of the president more firmly in the hands of the people. Second, an amendment that guarantees the right to vote without hardship would increase voter turnout and prevent voter suppression. Further, we support amendments that rein in the president, such as one requiring congressional authorizations for use of military force to expire after 2 years. Finally, due to increasing politicization of the Supreme Court, we support instituting 18-year term limits for justices to decrease the long-term impact of the appointees of a single party. The Constitution belongs to the people. The delegates gave us a framework of government that we now have the responsibility to amend. Thank you, and we're ready for your questions.
Thank you. Can you give me a bit more detail on how you are going to guarantee the right to vote and whether there are any restrictions that you would have? Is everybody over the age of 18, regardless of eligible to vote? Tell me what the rules will be.
Specifically, I think that all U.S. citizens over the ability to vote would be sort of the restrictions that we would place. These are all people who have a vested interest in living in this country. They're already a part of this country. And for this reason, all of those individuals are affected by our laws and should be allowed to vote in our elections to ultimately govern those laws.
I have to apologize to you. My computer did a really weird thing, right, as you were saying what those restrictions would be. Could I get you to repeat it for me?
Of course. I would argue that all U.S. citizens over the age of 18 should be allowed to vote.
However, we would also extend the right to vote to those actually to the age of 16. Counties or cities like Berkeley, California have actually allowed 16-year-olds to begin to vote in the school board elections. And this is an example of how their 16-year-olds are learning how to take part in electoral or in the voting process. And this would be coupled as well with civics education to ensure that our students in school are not only voting, but also learning what it means to vote and be a part of the country in that way.
Additionally, it's really important in our amendment to include a clause that says you can vote without hardship, because currently in Georgia, Senate Bill 202 passed the House. And this bill increases voter hardship through voter IDs and generally suppresses many voters. So it's important to have a clause in the amendment that would ensure that all voters get a chance to vote.
And I apologize, but if you're going to talk about hardship, tell me what that means. And specifically, I'm asking, if I live in Montana, where there are about 50 of us in a 80 square mile area, how do we decide how many polling places there would be?
A lot of our amendment would actually come from some of the provisions in the For the People Act that recently passed the House. In this specific example of how many polling places, we would ensure that everyone is able to get to that polling place through either public transportation or in a reasonable way, or walking, or in a way. And the For the People Act actually says that people should not have to wait more than 30 minutes to cast their ballot. And so that would be a similar provision that would be guaranteed under this right to vote without hardship.
Also,
okay.
instituting absentee ballots also would be greatly beneficial. In Oregon, it increased voter turnout in the federal election by 10%. And this is also included in Bill HR 1 that would greatly reduce the hardships on voters.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm interested in one of the other big topics from the federal convention forward. And they talked a lot about it, and it gave a lot of people, gave them nightmares, including the anti-federalists, and that's the role of the executive and the choosing of the executive. So that by the early 21st century, we have people talking about the cult of the presidency. Were the anti-federalists right in their fear about executive power? So help me understand your understanding of the convention's thinking about the executive going forward.
The most important thing to understand about how the founders viewed the executive power is that they really sort of had these conflicting ideals of what the executive should look like. On one hand, they had existed as colonies under the English monarchy and were subject to these colonial governors that really had absolute authority over the legislature. On the other hand, they had also been subject to the Articles of Confederation, which didn't have a defined executive. And for that reason, really couldn't be as energetic a government as many of the founders liked. And for this reason, they were sort of going into the convention with new ideas, with their own ideas about what this executive could look like, leading to sort of the ambiguous power we talked about.
According to historian Michael Klarman, the delegates at the convention were much more nationalist, had much more nationalist views than the average American. And this was because they had all come from nationalizing experiences. Since they were chosen by state legislatures, many of them had served in the Revolutionary War or served on the Continental Congress. And for this reason, they had seen the flaws in the weak executive with the Articles of Confederation and were intent on making a stronger executive to solve that problem.
Yeah, one executive or plural executives?
That depends on the plan of government presented. James Madison's Virginia plan, which was the first presented at the Constitutional Convention on May 29th, called for a single, less defined executive, whereas William Patterson's plan, presented later on, called for a council of executives. Ultimately, the framers decided on one executive to fulfill that energetic nature that they desired.
And another anti-federalist was an old Whig who actually identified the outlines of the executive power to be an elected king. And over the course of history, we've seen that the president's power become more and more closer to the people. We can see that through 34 states binding electoral votes to the popular vote in each state, making the president want to, the people more directly voting for the president, as well as through increased social media use that has allowed the president to directly speak with the people and share their own thoughts rather than going through Congress or having Congress be the direct relationship to the people.
However, the Federalists were the Federalists were, the Federalists were in Federalist 68, Hamilton writes that the Electoral College will certainly produce an executive with requisite qualifications. And they thought the Electoral College would produce a president similar to George Washington, and that their ambiguity in the executive branch wouldn't really be a big problem because the single executive would surely be responsible.
This was partially what resulted in the framers being so ambiguous about the executive branch compared to other branches like the legislative and judicial, where they clearly outlined powers.
I'd like to go back to your proposal regarding amending the Constitution to allow for the right to vote without hardship. Can you tell us what other constitutional amendments there have been regarding voting and why they haven't been enough to ensure the right to vote?
To answer the first part of your question, the amendments that have ensured the right to vote were the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to Black men, the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to women, and the 26th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for 18 following sort of backlash to the draft during the Vietnam War.
However, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had to be passed after the 15th Amendment because states were continuing to pass literacy tests that would seriously disenfranchise and focus on targeting disenfranchising Black men. And so this is an example of how the rights or the amendments regarding voting still had to be coupled with congressional mandates to ensure that the right to vote was not actually being infringed despite the state legislatures continuing to pass laws around this.
So I would like just briefly to talk about the 18-year term limit on Supreme Court justices. That seems to me to set up a situation where you can predict who's going to be there and therefore, you know, just kind of wait out the folks you don't like and wait till you get a more favorable court. Isn't that really going against what we wanted? a court that was removed from political influence?
Well, that is certainly a possibility that you would know which justices are leaving. There are two reasons why waiting to bring a case might not be the best move. For one, you might not necessarily know which president would appoint these justices. And you don't know which justice it would be. Control of the Senate, which confirms Supreme Court justices under Article 3, Section 1, or the president who appoints them would be unknown. And for this reason, and similarly, waiting for that case, you might have to wait 4 years, 6 years, 8 years to actually get a ruling on a case that, would be incredibly beneficial to have a ruling on.
And some anti-federalists believe that this independent judiciary could be actually very dangerous. In Brutus V, an anti-federalist Brutus wrote that the judiciary would be independent of heaven itself, given all the powers it contained and the lifelong term limits. So it may have been actually too independent in the first place.
And passing an amendment like this could be hard. And so following legislation as proposed by Congressmember Ro Khanna would allow for justices to be removed from the bench after 18 years and follow into a kind of senior level position. And they would still be on part of the Supreme Court. However, they would not be actually giving opinions for individual cases. And so this would kind of continue to allow for like turn, but also, may I finish my thought, please? Thank you. But would allow for new justices to step in and to kind of decrease this long-term impact.
Yeah. Nice job.
So let me just tell you, I did enjoy your presentation. I was pleased that you were able to talk about there being current suggestion. The For the People Act is what you see as the framework for your proposed amendment. I was really glad that we got the chance for you to go back and make reference to the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, rather than have me go, well, I think that's what they were talking about. I was really glad that we got the chance to double back and have you say that. Had some other thoughts when you were talking about which amendments specifically had made reference to voting rights, but you covered what I needed to hear, and I very much enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, some of these are the big issues that have been debated since the 18th century to today by state houses and congresses, presidents, Supreme Court justices. These are hard issues. So of course we ask for high school students to solve them for us. So that what we're really looking for is for you to take a position and defend it, think through your answers and such. And I thought you did a nice job of that. I think that on a couple of issues, I'm a 19th century historian. I work in the era of Lincoln. Take a look at the 15th Amendment. It doesn't guarantee the right to vote to anyone. It's the states shall not deny the vote. It's a negative amendment. So just make sure you've got a full grasp on it, on some of these issues. It's a small piece, because on the big picture, you did a really nice job of covering the waterfront. It was engaging, and I liked what you did very much.
I would also like to commend you for your presentation. You discussed the main debates among the framers in terms of the big states versus the small states, the issue of slavery. I like your discussion of slavery and your information that there were 4 million slaves, and then your discussion of the 13th, 14th, and 15th civil rights amendments and the black codes and Jim Crow laws. I think that was good. And in terms of executive power, you had 3 good examples that you discussed of excesses of executive power, which I think were good. And then you had 4 interesting proposals for amending the Constitution. We didn't have enough time to go into all of them. Certainly a lot of people have talked about changing or abolishing the Electoral College. The right to vote without hardship is interesting, and that's been certainly in the news more recently with proposed congressional legislation and the proposed state laws following last fall's election. And we didn't really get to talk about the congressional authorization regarding the use of force. That would have been interesting to exchange comments about. And 18-year term limits has also been discussed recently. As a judge, I would pose to you the question of whether it's better to have term limits for judges, or whether the framers didn't impose term limits because they thought that because of the doctrine of judicial independence, judges would not be subject to the whims of politics and then could vote as they thought the law required, regardless of whether their decisions would be unpopular. But people have argued that position, and also the position that there should be term limits. So I thought we had a nice discussion about that. So congratulations to you on your presentation, and again on your being in the top 12 for the We the People competition.
Hey, I want to go back to something really briefly, because I don't want you to think you left out a whole bunch. And I just replayed my comments to you in my mind, and I talked about the amendments. The only one that I was missing was the 24th amendment, and that was the one that made reference to poll tax. That was what I had to. So
right.
I didn't want to leave you off going, oh gosh, what did we forget? That was what I was thinking about. But I really, like I said, enjoyed what you did. Now I apologize for coming back.
Yeah, good work.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thanks. Thank you.